a retired, just recently, associate professor of finance from the University of Toledo. I have a PhD in economics from Iowa State University with fields in monetary theory, industrial organization, and engineering valuation. I was a professor for 30 years, teaching predominantly in the area of investments and financial markets and institutions. I also work very closely, and I'm on the board of the Northwest Ohio Patriot Coalition, which encompasses a bunch of we're an umbrella organization of the Children of Liberty, Back to Basics, Levi Four, and the Perrysburg Patriots. I also served with my good friend in the middle of the room, Jeff Lighty. He's my boss as the treasurer. I'm the assistant treasurer of the Northwest Ohio Conservative Coalition, which is a federally registered political action committee which supports conservative causes and candidates in Northwest Ohio. So I'm very happy to be here and to be able to participate in this. We have a wonderful panel that we are going to be talking about the Federal Reserve. If some of you had a chance to hear one of our panelists this morning talk about the Fed, Mr. Wagner, it was, I think there were a lot of people who had questions and in a very short presentation, and as I can tell you, having taught classes about the Federal Reserve, it sure takes a lot more than 45 minutes or so to really do it justice. It's a very complicated topic. And so what I'd like to do before I introduce our speakers is Paul Baker asked me to give a brief overview for those of you who maybe haven't had a course in financial markets and institutions or money and banking, a little bit about the structure of the Fed and how it is designed. Whether it works that way or not is something we can all talk about and ask questions about. The Federal Reserve is chartered by the federal government. It comes from an act of Congress. It is, in some sense, a private corporation, but it is what the federal government creates, the federal government could take away. It is not, in that sense, it's directly part of the government, but not, it's only sanctioned to be run the way it is because of government mandate. It's not part of the Constitution. It was a law. Part of the way the Fed was designed was just like everything else happens in Washington. It was a matter of compromises that were made. And one of the things that they were very interested in was having some regional input into Federal Reserve policy, and one of those, so the upshot of that is we have 12 different Federal Reserve districts. For those of you who get into looking at currency, each of the currency is printed by a different, or distributed, I should say, by a different Federal Reserve Bank, and it has different letters on it. You can tell what Federal Reserve Bank your currency came through. We're standing here in Columbus, Ohio, which has, which I believe is part of the Cleveland Fed district. I live up in Toledo. I know I'm part of the Cleveland Fed's district. But there are district Federal Reserve banks in Chicago and New York and places like that. So there's 12 of them around the country. That is a relatively important thing, and I know Mr. Wagner talked about that this morning a little bit, because the presidents of the district banks serve on the Federal Open Market Committee on a rotating basis, with one exception, it's the president of the New York Fed. He's always on it. I say he because I think it's always been a guy. So, but if there was a female president of the New York Fed, my apologies to her. But the president of each of 3 or 4 of the Fed, I think it's 3, rotate through the Federal Open Market Committee, which is where monetary policy is made. So those are not unimportant positions, and often that is where there is some disagreement with Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan or whoever is the presidents of those Federal Reserve banks often have very different views on the economy and on monetary policy. And we've seen some of that recently. Tom Hoenig, who is leaving and retiring from the Kansas City Fed, was on the FOMC and was a very interested in controlling inflation, and very vocal about his disagreements with quantitative easing, 1, 2, 2.5, wherever we're on now. So the Federal Reserve is a source of a lot of controversy. And one of the things that we're going to, what I think Paul did a great job putting together this panel, because I think we're going to have some very different opinions, okay? You're going to hear both extremes maybe a little bit, and that's good, because we believe in the Patriot movement that you can all make intelligent decisions and listen to the facts and make up your own mind. So this is not going to be a one-sided presentation. I think that's a very good thing. Let me get started on this side with the introduction so you know who we're talking to. This is Dr. Robert Wagner. He gave the presentation this morning on understanding the Fed. He has been very involved in, he's taught money and banking classes in college. He has been very involved in talking about TARP, which has been a very controversial program, and what the part of that the Fed was responsible for, distinguishing that from what the government did with General Motors and other things. He tries, and as he tried this morning, to give his viewpoint and say these are the things that he thinks are important relative to understanding the Federal Reserve. I think I didn't agree with everything he said this morning, but I thought he did a very fine job presenting it. And so if you haven't had a chance to see his presentation, tomorrow morning, he'll do it again. So if you didn't get a chance, I would suggest you come. So give a welcome to Dr. Robert Wagner. No, don't do that. Come on. Give people a chance. Next to him is Mike Sullivan. Mike is a wealth coach, founder of Wealth Coach Financial Services. So he's an investment advisor and financial planner working with individuals, small and medium-sized businesses. He says, his quote here is, "The investment environment has changed drastically since the late 1990s. I don't think we have to tell any of you that. And the old adage about putting your assets into a diversified position and tucking them away for a long time may not serve you as it did in the past." He did a presentation this morning, which I did not get to see, but hope to see it tomorrow morning, on housing bubbles and bubbles in financial markets. I think that's something that is something we may have learned to live with in the last 10 years or so, that we get these spikes. And so he's going to talk about some of that related to how it relates into the Fed. So Mike, we're happy to have you here. Our third speaker is John McManus, who is currently the president of the John Birch Society. He has been with the John Birch Society in a staff position since 1966, having served as the organization's director of public relations and its chief media representative. He began in 1973 writing a column called The Birch Log, and he has written a number of books. The one that I'm actually reading this out of is called Financial Terrorism, Hijacking America Under the Threat of Bankruptcy. I have heard a lot about Mr. McManus over the years, and I'm excited to get to meet him and to get to hear what he has to say about the Federal Reserve. John McManus. I thought I would start off, and it is my intention to give all of you a lot of time to ask questions. However, I do not want a lot of what I would call standing on the soapbox and giving 10 minutes of your opinion. We don't have that kind of time. I'd rather have it, comments be brief, questions or what we're interested in, and hearing what the panel has to say. We hopefully will have time afterwards to, if you want to talk to any of the panelists individually and give them your opinion. One of the great things about being involved in the Patriot movement is I meet an awful lot of opinionated people, and I think that's wonderful because you certainly know where people stand. The first thing I asked each of the speakers to do is I sent them an article that was written by Representative Ron Paul. that was published in the Washington Times just a few days ago. I emailed it to you. I did. Oh, well, no, let's do this, and then, unless you, I was going to let you do it. Ron Paul's article was titled "Time to End Federal Reserve Secrecy." And if you have been involved in reading what Representative Paul is talking about, he has been very much pushing audit the Fed. He's also now adding to that what he calls the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. He wants to find out how decisions were made relative to TARP money, what banks were benefited, etc. So I found this article and I thought, well, that might be an interesting place to start. And go a little bit on that, but before we ask this question, but I want to frame after they get through their part. I'm going to give each gentleman 5 minutes to sort of stake their turf. All right? Good. And after we do the 5 minutes of staking the turf, we're going to talk about Ron Paul and what he wants to do. So keeping that in mind. I think that's what you were referring to. We'll go there. So I think what I will do is get started here with, what did I say? I was going to start with John. I was going to let you go first.
Oh, okay.
If you want to put here, if you want to use the mic, since what? Your book. You may have your book back. I was going to try to keep it.
Cost you $10.
Capitalist,
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. It's a delight. I want to start off by mentioning a very famous political economic tract called the Communist Manifesto, 1848. Plank 5 of the Communist Manifesto was to create a national bank with an exclusive monopoly in the hands of the state. It was the forerunner of what we have in the Federal Reserve. But the truth of the matter is we've outmarched Marx, because Marx said in the hands of the state, and the Federal Reserve is in private hands. It is not a government agency, has never been a government agency, and it will continue that way until we get it abolished. In 1920, there was a famous economist named John Maynard Keynes. I don't agree with much of what he said later on. He's the man who said you can spend your way into prosperity. Right after I was married, I had to tell my wife, no, we can't do that. And nobody can do that. But he did say that, and he was, of course, very influential in the Roosevelt administration. But he wrote a book in 1920, and it started off by saying Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. Debauch, destroy. By a continuing process of inflation, he said, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily, and while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches a few. He went on to say, Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all of the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner in which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Now, you go to a dictionary today and you look up the word inflation, you're going to get deceived. I was amazed recently to see an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about the deficiency of the dictionaries defining inflation. A lot of them will say inflation is a condition of rising prices. No. Inflation is an increase in the money supply that leads to people rising prices because it lowers the value of the currency. If you believe that inflation is rising prices, you'll probably believe that wet streets cause rain. They don't. The effect of inflation is rising prices. Inflation itself is an increase in the quantity of currency. Now, I have two front-page headlines from the New York Times. The first one was Wednesday, November 26, 2008, the lead article out of the New York Times on page 1. U.S. plans $800 billion in lending to ease the crisis. In the very first sentence, it said that the Fed would print as much money as needed. Now, where did it get the value? They printed the money. Where did the value come from? It came from stealing your dollar's value and everybody else's. That's what John Maynard Keynes was talking about. We go a few months later, March 9th, 2009. Fed will inject $1 trillion more to aid economy. And the article says in the second paragraph, a way of getting more dollars into the economy, a tactic that amounts to creating vast new sums of money out of thin air. That's inflation, my friends. That's inflation. Right? What does it do? It lowers the value of your dollars. Why does it cost more to go to the supermarket? Because the dollars are less valuable. Why does it cost more for gasoline for your automobile? Because the dollars are less valuable. In fact, in 1913, a dollar was worth 100 cents when the Fed was started, and a dollar is now worth 4 cents compared to what it was worth in 1913. And so I am one of those who say it's time to abolish the Fed. I don't expect to do it overnight. I think that would be chaos. I think it would take a good amount of time. And one other thing that has to be done, and done very clearly and very effectively, is to do away with the legal tender law that says only the Federal Reserve note is legal currency. What a bit of tyranny that is. I'm in favor of the states all across this country adopting gold and silver as legal tender in their state. I think it's time for them to do that, and if they do that, it will begin to unroll the Fed, because the people will then see that the dollar is losing its value and gold and silver are not. All right? Am I finished?
Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I just have to pull up some slides here. We'll take a look. John and I haven't met. You might find that surprising after I run slides here, but it's the first time that we've met. Sure. That good? Better? Or there's a volume on it.
Or you guys can use this too.
Is this better?
We're getting complaints from next door they can't hear their own.
How about this?
Oh.
Better?
You're down to 4 minutes.
The bubble in my time slide. Okay. Well, I brought this slide that came out last night. It was from CNBC. You see June 30th, and it's from the maestro himself, Al Greenspan, who said that $2 trillion quantitative easing did little to loosen credit and boost the economy. So that's about it. It's a beautiful day. Who wants to go fishing? Up next, I have a picture of the USDebtClock.org. Many of you may have seen this. There's a number of pictures on there. The top left corner is the national debt, 14-some-odd trillion that we are focused on all the time. The bigger number is down at the bottom. You see the U.S. unfunded liabilities at $114 trillion. You can lump that on there. Right above that, some national assets of 75. Maybe if we sold everything to China, we could reduce the net debt a little bit. But on the right, this is kind of a dreary report card here. You see the top yellow circle item is actual unemployed, 24 million. And the yellow circle underneath it, 139 million is the total workforce, significantly higher than we typically hear. And the last one down low is food stamps, 45 million. So for me, that's kind of a report card on what the Federal Reserve System has brought us to. They're not alone. I think it's complicit with Congress and their spending and everything else, but certainly it doesn't look like a system I build a country around. How does it look to you? When we overspend, when the Congress overspends, the Treasury goes out and borrows. This is the custody account of foreign borrowers. In 2007, it started out 1.2 trillion, and just 4 years later, we're up to 2.6 trillion. You can see it flattening out. That's because people are not borrowing anymore. China and Russia have dumped their treasuries the last 5 months, and when they can't borrow, the big red bar there is the Fed itself, and that kind of alludes to what John was talking about. We spend 110 trillion more, or billion more a month than we take in. And the quantitative easing has been the last 6 months, since December, actually 7 months, ended yesterday, of $110 billion. And last 4th of July, this was underneath China and Japan, which are the two blue ones to the right, in the 800 neighborhood. And this is as of the end of December. Now it's almost $1.5 trillion, so almost double those two bars. It's kind of creating money out of thin air. On the left is the long gray bar is the $1.5 trillion deficit. Divide 1.5 trillion by 12 months, you get 110 billion. I found it ironic that Ben Bernanke was lecturing in Congress 2 weeks ago about not spending so much and being more fiscally prudent. He was the one that created the 110 billion to help us get through over the hump. And then this is the jingle or key that I mentioned in the class this morning. It's the little piece that you see on the far left, but that's what you get. That's the theater up in Washington. And the Democrats say, well, we're willing to cut $10 billion of the money that we're going to spend that we don't already have. And then the Republicans say, well, we'll cut $61 billion of the money we're going to spend that we don't already have. And then the Democrats say, you can't do that, everybody will die. And the Republicans say, okay, how about 36? Then say 20, we'll come to 28. That's about 10 days of deficit spending. This system has also brought some significant disparities in wealth and income generation. You can see right here in this pie chart, the top 1% of people control 42% of the financial assets, stocks, real estate, so forth. The next 19 control the next 51%, collectively that's 93%, and that leaves 80% for the bottom, or 7% for the bottom 80%. It's a significant difference. As we talked about this morning, a lot of it sprung loose when Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999, and the investment bankers were able to get into the commercial banking henhouse, so to speak. So I have more slides, but I think I'm about through here. So I'm going to pass it to
That's right.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. I feel a lot like John Adams at the Boston Massacre trial here. And I tell you one thing, I wish I would have had a professor like Linda, and I'm sorry to hear that you're retiring, because that's the kind of professor I think we want teaching in our colleges. Many of you have seen the presentation, so hopefully you already have a background from where I come from. But you'll see where I'm coming from tonight or tomorrow night if you go to the dinner with Herman Cain. This was sent to me the other day. And, you know, the Ron Paul people went up to Herman Cain and they wanted him to say, let's abolish the Fed. And he said, great, if you give me a better alternative. And that's what this all comes down to. I mean, we can all beat up on the Fed all we want, but you got to remember, we're the #1 economy in the world. You know, we're the reserve currency of the world. It's up to us to design a system that has put us in this position. We became the world's reserve currency. We became the greatest economic superpower ever under the tutelage of the Fed. I mean, the bottom line is, we are here today because of the system that existed, and the Federal Reserve was part of that system. So I'm all for ending the Fed. You just give me a better alternative, and then we can start to talk. But I'm not the type of person that's going to grab a pitchfork and a torch and go burn down the house before I figure out where I'm going to live next. It's just not going to happen. So let's take a look. But that's basically my opinion. I'm all for it. I'm open-minded. Matter of fact, I've given presentations on where we could improve upon the Fed, and we'll hit on some of those questions. Okay, I'm glad Mike brought it. We're all talking the same language here. This is the problem. $114 trillion in debt. Okay? That is bankruptcy of America. Okay? You don't get out of this. This is money that is spent. Right? We've done this to our children. Now, Mike had a slide up there a minute ago about the Federal Reserve and what they've done. That was $1.6 trillion. Compare $1.6 trillion to what Congress did, $114 trillion. The focus should not be on the Fed issuing quantitative easing to save a banking system. It should be on Congress, the people who spent the money. Okay? The Federal Reserve doesn't spend any money. It makes loans. It's a bank. Right? And sure, during this recent period, during where they had to go out and save the banks, they had to print money. We told them to do that. In our charter, we told them you're the lender of last resort. If you don't act as the lender of last resort, you get another Great Depression. So I'm very glad they went out and printed the money. I'd much rather have a surviving economy and not a Great Depression and a little bit more money out there. You've got two tough decisions to make. You can either have a depression or print money. We'll print money. But once again, if you want to really get the torches out, go after the people that spent the money. And those people is Congress. Next. Now, as far as our history goes, we've been through this in the Fed before. This is the first central bank, right? We ended it. We fell in a Great Depression. We started a second central bank. We ended it. We fell in a Great Depression. We've been through this and the Fed stuff before without a game plan, and it ends very bad. And yes, you're right. In the Communist Manifesto, they do say we should have a central bank. The problem is the Communist Manifesto was written in 1864. Our founding fathers, George Washington, way back in 1792, created the very first one. So we beat Marx. Marx must have just looked at this and said, that's a good system. Let's stick with it. All right? We get out the pitchforks and torches about TARP. The part of TARP that the Federal Reserve was involved in made 8.2%. We rescued the banking system, we didn't fall into the Great Depression, and we got paid for it. To me, that's a successful program. What is the alternative? The Federal Reserve doesn't do anything, and we repeat the Great Depression. I would much rather make money to save ourselves than to sit back and just let the system collapse. And that's exactly what they did in the Great Depression. If you want to know what the system is without a Federal Reserve, watch It's a Wonderful Life. All right? Mr. Potter is the guy you run to. Before the Federal Reserve, you had to go ask J.P. Morgan for a loan. Right? I don't want to go back to It's a Wonderful Life. I'd much rather have a system today. Nobody in this room had Ben Bernanke come up to you and say, look, I'll buy all your deposits for 50 cents on the dollar. There's not a single person in this room that sat safely during this crisis knowing that their money was 100% guaranteed in those banks. There were no bank runs. Nobody lost a red cent. The only people that lost money were the bankers that made foolish loans, and that's who paid. I mean, so if you really hate bankers, you should favor the Fed because the Fed looked out for you and not the bankers, and that's why Lehman Brothers went under. So what I like, the way I approach this is focus on who causes the problem, because there's fiscal policy and there's monetary policy. Monetary policy did not get us in this mess. It will not get us out of this mess. But if you really want to solve the problems of America, it's get out of our house. Turn over the Congress and get some Tea Party people in Congress. If you want lower food prices, repeal the ethanol laws. That'll crash the food prices. If you want lower energy prices, drill, baby, drill, and all the above. Start pumping. Use the free market to solve these problems. Ending the Fed won't solve any of the problems. But you can just go down here, and I'm saying if you want to solve many of our problems, focus on the issues and focus on policies that will solve those issues.
Okay. We've got a few questions, and then we'll get to you, I promise. Okay, the question about Federal Reserve transparency. That's been an issue that Ron Paul has brought up. Also, auditing the Fed. I think auditing not so much from an accounting standpoint as to what the Fed is actually doing and how it reaches its decisions. Like to go start at that end. Tell me what you think about Representative Paul's philosophy.
Well, Ron Paul is anxious to have the Fed be an open book so we know what goes on. And he's uncovered some information about it. It's in this article. We not only bailed out banks and corporations here in the United States, we did it in Europe. But the whole idea of the Fed, it was started in secrecy. It was conspiratorially arranged, according to one of its participants. The book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, talks about the secret meeting that was held in 1910. And at that secret meeting in 1910, you had one man named Frank Vanderlip, who was a banker from New York City, who later in 1935 wrote a book. His book was serialized in the Saturday Evening Post, and he said that there was a time back in 1910 when I felt as secret, indeed, as a conspirator, when he went to Jekyll Island with Paul Warburg and several others, and they conceived the Federal Reserve. Now, they knew that they couldn't get it introduced as the Aldrich Bill because Aldrich was well known as a big money banker-type individual. He was a Rhode Island senator. So they persuaded a couple of others in Congress, and it came out as the Glass-Steagall Act, and there was more deception there. I had a great teacher one time who said, if it's secret, it stinks. The whole idea of the Fed was secret. That great teacher was my father. He was correct. The Fed was conceived in secrecy, was sold to the American people as something that it really wasn't, and it has done a tremendous amount of harm, destroying the economic life of our country. Now, if you want to know what happens when you continue to inflate the currency, just consider what happened in Germany in the 1920s. After the World War I was over and Germany was forced to pay a lot of reparations, they didn't have the money, so what did they do? They printed it. They started paying it off with those dollars. Well, what was the effect on the German people? Many of them lost their homes. They lost their businesses. They lost their savings. It gave rise to an absolute desperate situation in Germany, and it led to a man named Adolf Hitler. And that has happened over and over again. You see the same thing recently happening in Zimbabwe. Inflation is a killer. And inflation is what the Fed does and continues to do, and it's got to stop.
Regarding Representative Paul's article, I think the Fed has proven time and again that they can't do things in the dark that are above board. You can go to YouTube just about anywhere and see Representative Paul's grilling of different representatives of the Federal Reserve. I've seen him make the chairman and the lead counsel squirm. Alan Grayson, representative out of Orlando, does the same thing. He used to be a prosecutor. It's kind of fun to watch him on YouTube if you're bored. Kind of get some kicks out of that. But there are all types of things that go on, and I think this correlates to the wealth, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and there's an open corridor that goes back and forth from the Fed to Congress to the big banks, back and forth from banks to Congress, and so forth. And they receive all kinds of special privileges. There's a former director, board member, he was chairman actually of the New York Fed, I believe, during the crisis, Stephen Friedman, also on the board of Goldman Sachs. And he received waivers from both the New York Fed and Goldman Sachs to invest in 37,000 shares of Goldman Sachs at that point in time with all the inside knowledge. That's $2 million right now. And it broke all the bylaws that existed at that point in time. So I think, to Dr. Wagner's point, the Fed may not be the entire problem that we have. Certainly the Congress overspends, but in my view, it's a grand enabler, and if we were going to fix it, I would look long and hard at what we were going to do to it. I would not give him unlimited authority to create currency out of thin air, but perhaps, like John McManus indicates, peg it at least to gold or silver, and constrain them and handcuff them so that they can't do whatever they want.
Okay, I think this article they're referring to is Paul, Time to End Federal Reserve Secrecy. Now, what it does is it highlights two very important things. The Federal Reserve has different roles. The main issue about the Federal Reserve is control of monetary policy, where they're setting the interest rates, the short-term interest rates, for the rest of the economy. It's kind of like a throttle for the economy. They adjust the money supply, they adjust the interest rates to speed up or slow down the economy to battle inflation or unemployment. Okay? That is secret, and it should always be secret. If you want to get into a situation where you have hyperinflation, you politicize that. That is, so when you read this issue, when Ron Paul is saying we need to inspect the monetary policy, that's allowing politicians to influence Ben Bernanke on interest rates and unemployment. What we did when we created the Federal Reserve was we deliberately set it up, and there's a great way to understand the Fed when you're talking about it. It's called, in plain English, making sense of the Federal Reserve. It goes through the entire structure that Linda talked about. It helps you understand what's going on there. But the Fed does two things. We created the Fed, and we told it to do a few things. One, maintain stable prices. Two, maintain low unemployment. Three, act as a lender of last resort. What you saw recently was it acting as a lender of last resort. They pumped money up to save the banking system. If we don't like that, we can go rewrite their charter and say, look, Ben, no longer do you bail out the banking system. We want you to repeat what they did in the Great Depression. If you don't like them trying to maintain stable prices, you can say, Ben, write out that stable prices and we'll put up with inflation. But the reason we have printed all this money, and we don't have hyperinflation anywhere close to the Weimar Republic, and we don't have hyperinflation anywhere near Zimbabwe, because we collar the Fed and say, look, you can only print money within this range. And so when Ron Paul says we need to audit the Fed, he's not talking about the monetary, the books. You can audit the books. They do it all the time. That's what that Alan Grayson video is. He's grilling the woman who audits the Fed. It's the monetary policy that you don't want to see. You want to act in secrecy. Now, why would you want it to be in secret? we've given them laws and they're following the laws. If I know what the Federal Reserve is doing, and I know what they're going to release, and I know what they're going to do in the interest rates, people like me and Mike, we can sit there and I go, I know the Fed's going to lower interest rates, that's going to drive bond prices up, I can game the system. So there's a tremendous reason why you keep monetary policy secret. You're going to find out after the fact anyways, because the rates change, and then they release their minutes. You don't want people knowing about it in advance. Now, as far as the books go, you're right, we need to start taking a look at that. But when you read through this, what you notice is that these foreign banks they're talking about, they're not talking about foreign banks, they're talking about foreign branches in the U.S. So if you have an account at UBS or the Royal Bank of Scotland, you can feel safe that your money is safe. So if you have a deposit in a foreign bank, thank God Ben Bernanke made loans to the foreign banks.
I also want to mention something, if I may, given a little bit of knowledge of economic history. I think when you compare to the Depression and the fact that the Fed didn't do what it was supposed to do, I think part of the issue is we have now a financial deposit insurance system. And I was just at a seminar that Bill Isaac, who was the head of the FDIC during this situation, during the last few years, had said he was very opposed to TARP. And he felt that the way you protect all of our money is through the FDIC. And you allow banks to fail. If a bank makes a lot of stupid loans, just like if you make your pizza parlor and you make bad tasting pizza, you're going to be out of the pizza business, okay? If you're a bank and you make a lot of bad loans, maybe you shouldn't be a banker anymore. Sometimes acting as a lender of last resort props up people that should be allowed to fail. Okay, that's the alternative argument. That if you just say to the FDIC, we're going to pump more money in, I know there's going to be bank failures. I'm old enough to have lived through the late 70s, early 80s, where we had thousands of bank failures. I also have great concerns and had great concerns about the repeal of Glass-Steagall. For those of you who don't know what Glass-Steagall was, it was a law that said there had to be a separation between commercial banking, lending, and investment banking, doing equities. That stayed in place from the early 30s until about 1999 they started lifting it. The problem with not having Glass-Steagall is it allows for a concentration of economic power. In other words, you start having banks and lending to people who they are doing equity deals with, and after a while you end up with these sort of conglomerates, and we're seeing some of that now. So I think I agree with everything, a little bit of everything that I've heard up here, which is usually what happens. But I think that we have to look historically that I think certainly I agree with Mike, there's some tweaking that needs to be done in here in terms of what can the Fed do, but that's sort of my viewpoint. Yes, first you and then you had a question. Yes?
I'd like to know who headed up the Federal Reserve since inception of the organization. I think it's the Council on Formulation, and I'd like to have them respond to that, because this Council on Formulation is once one world government.
The gentleman's correct. Members of the Council on Foreign Relations have led the Fed, not always, but most of the time. I have a quote on the back cover of my book here from a man named Paul Volcker, who was the former Federal Reserve Chairman. This was 1979. He said, "The standard of living of the average American has to decline. I don't think you can escape that." Isn't that nice? Did you hear what I said? He wants the standard of living of the American people to decline. Right? He became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he helped to do that. He helped to do that by corrupting the value of the dollar. Right? Now, we've heard here a little bit about, this morning I heard Dr. Wagner talking about the Constitution and the fact that we started a central bank right after the Constitution was formed. And this is true, and they shouldn't have done it. But please don't blame George Washington, blame Alexander Hamilton. A centrist, if there ever was one, among the founding fathers. The Constitution of the United States says Congress shall have power to coin money. Now, Alan Greenspan has told us that that gives them the power to have a Federal Reserve. I don't see it. I don't see that the power to coin money. What the power to coin money meant is you can start a mint. And they did. They started a mint in 1792. And the people could take their gold and their silver to the mint and have it stamped into coinage of a fixed size, weight, and purity. Right? And that gave stability to the monetary system. Now, we've heard here from Dr. Wagner and others feel the same way, that because of a crisis here and a crisis there and a crisis there, we had to have a Federal Reserve. Well, what caused those crises? Go back and look at the history of it, and you'll find that some of the big bankers caused the crisis. They were doing what Rahm Emanuel has said recently: a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Right? So they didn't waste it, they started the Federal Reserve. And now we don't have crises, we have depressions, we have recessions, we have the value of the dollar going in the toilet. Now, we're facing, this country is facing bankruptcy. Now, let's define that term. What does bankruptcy mean? It means you don't have an ability to borrow. Now, we've already heard from Dr. Wagner here that China has decided that they don't want to buy any more U.S. treasuries. Japan doesn't want to do it either. India is now shunning the dollar, and so on. We're getting to a situation where the dollar is going to be totally worthless. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't look forward to that at all. I know what that would mean for our country. It would mean utter chaos. It would mean neighbor attacking neighbor to get food. It would be all kinds of problems. That's the way we're headed. And the Federal Reserve has a major role to play in it. I agree with Dr. Wagner about the fact that Congress is also very guilty because they have run up the debt. The debt is close to $200 trillion, right? When you add the unfunded obligations to the obligations that they admit, you're close to $200 trillion.
Add I don't know whether the Council of Foreign Relations is the cause or the effect of the Bilderberg Group or any of those. However, if you look at that corridor I mentioned before, it's the same people that go back and forth. And as we talked about this morning, what I think is missing not only at the Fed and the big banks, but in this country overall, is there's a massive disconnect between reward and personal risk. And the people that make these decisions lose tens of millions, $20 million, $30 million, and nothing happens to them. When Glass-Steagall was about to pass, Robert Rubin, I believe, was Secretary of the Treasury, along with Larry Summers, cause or effect, I don't know. But he resigned and he went over to Citibank, and shortly after Glass-Steagall was repealed, he led Citigroup, now Citigroup, to be the first of the too big to fail banks by acquiring Travelers and Smith Barney and everything else. And if you remember in the crash itself, which of the too big to fail banks took it the hardest? So I don't know whether the CFR is the driver or whether you just get there once you're good enough to do the dirty work.
The process that I know and I understand is that we simply nominate Federal Reserve chairmen and the Congress approves them. That's you'll see the president. That's what I'm saying. I mean, you'll see the president nominate and then the Congress will approve the chairman. That's the process. I understand. If they're members of a group or not, I'm not sure, but they typically get there because they've proven themselves to be very competent bankers. However, if you
or economists,
or economists,
professors, or whoever.
Yeah, they're mostly economists. Well, the one thing though is, if you remember that formula I showed you, MV equals PQ, you don't even need a person to run that thing. All you need is a computer. If Milton Friedman's whole theory is get rid. I mean, I'm all for ending the Fed. Let's replace it with a computer, and it just simply monitors unemployment and inflation. It cranks up money when unemployment goes up. It pulls it out when inflation goes down. So you could literally replace the Federal Reserve with a computer, and I'm all for that. So if you want to start that movement, count me in.
As long as it doesn't grant bonuses.
Yeah.
This gentleman here had a question.
Oh,
Do you remember?
You've got bunches. First of all, about structure. Who owns the Fed? Who nominates the people? Is it truly that, does the president nominate people?
The president nominates, there's 12 members of the Board of Governors,
Where do they come from?
7 members of the Board of Governors, excuse me. They are all nominated for very long terms. I think it's 14 years.
Yes, so
They
long
they cannot be fired, they can only be impeached. So when a new president comes into office, he doesn't get to fire anybody. Okay? Now, that sounds very apolitical. The problem with it is that sort of revolving door he was talking about. I have known in my lifetime a couple of people who have served their full 14-year terms on the Board of Governors. Actually, one of them was a friend of my father's, a graduate student buddy of my father's, who served on the Federal Reserve Board for 14 years. The average duration is about 2 or 3 years. And the reason is because, one, you don't make a whole lot of money being on the Federal Reserve Board. You have to put all your assets into blind trust, so you can't do any investing or do anything around. You can't do anything else on the outside. So for people who are well-known, trained economists, bankers, etc., that doesn't sound like a very sweet gig for 14 years, okay? And so they don't stay. The chairman of the Board of Governors also has a 14-year term as a board member, but he can only be there as chairman for 4 years, and then he can be reappointed. So at that point, he can be, quote, fired, okay? Meaning not reappointed. Could he potentially then just stay on the board and not be chairman? Yes, but the general rule is once they're not reappointed, they leave the board. Again, it's good money to not be on the board, and they can go give speeches and, you know, do consulting and maybe be on the Council of Foreign Relations. But I'm saying they could do something that's probably more lucrative than what they were doing. One more thing. We got a lot of questions. Go ahead.
We talk a lot about, and everyone here agrees, that we've gotten out of control. There's an old saying, don't let the camel's nose under the tent, or else you'll have the whole camel in there. Is it your guys' opinion that the Federal Reserve is the camel's nose, the camel, or what?
It's interesting. It's an interesting analogy. I have to think about it.
I think the Federal Reserve is a herd of camels. I can't stress this too much. What is money? Money is a medium for exchange. That's all it is. It can be anything. And over the course of history, you have had seashells used as money. You have had cattle, all different kinds of things, nails, all different kinds of things can be used as money. But the course of history has shown nobody dreamed this up in an economic class or in a college or anything. The course of history has shown that sensible people have turned to gold and silver. Mostly gold. Now you got a situation here where an ounce of gold in the Roman days would buy somebody a fancy toga, a pair of nice sandals, a wonderful belt, and so forth. And an ounce of gold today, you can go down to a haberdashery store today and you can get the best suit that they have and a nice pair of shoes and a nice belt and a tie and so forth. All right? So the gold is still as valuable. What has happened is the dollar has shrunk. And the dollar has shrunk. Now, we hear that nobody really suffers because the Federal Reserve has come to the rescue and has saved us from a cataclysm and so forth. That's false. That's totally false. Everyone who holds a dollar loses when they inflate the currency. I can't make that point any stronger. And that's a point that seems to escape a lot of people. A lot of people, of course, rely on a false definition of the word inflation. They say it's rising prices. Remember what I said. If you believe inflation is rising prices, you will believe that wet streets cause rain, and they don't.
I think it's the grand enabler, whichever part of the camel that is in that analogy. But and I agree on the inflation. I gave out a website today. Many of you already know it. It's shadowstats.com, and that is former economist John Williams, and he tracks the 1990 definition of inflation. So if you want to watch inflation, that's what you should look at. The number that's reported uses hedonics, and all types of other witchcraft to decide that you don't need to eat steak anymore, but you should eat ground beef instead. Therefore, inflation is only 1.5%.
There's major problems with CPI, and so I just encourage you. The way I take a look at what inflation is I rely on the market to tell me what the inflation rate is, and the 10-year Treasury will tell you what it is. It's near record lows. You can take a look at the spread between the tips and the Treasury, and it's near record lows. The market doesn't believe that we have inflation. So even without the CPI, there's no market indicators showing you that we have inflation, at least not monetary inflation. Now, we do have food inflation, but that's because we're burning 40% of our corn, which distorts the agricultural market. We have inflation in the energy market, but that's because of the turmoil in the Middle East. There's supply and demand-driven inflation, and that's a good type of inflation because that's a signal the market's giving, but it's not due to monetary policy. If there was monetary policy driving these prices higher, all energy prices would be going higher, and natural gas is 40% low, or 80% lower than when all this crisis and we printed all this money. The one thing about the gold standard, though, and I find this one really ironic, is the gold standard, the way it's managed is it's a certain unit of gold. It's an ounce of gold or whatever value you want, and they stamp a value on it. All right? So once they do that, that gold price is fixed. So what you're doing is you're allowing the government to fix the price of gold forever. It's 1 ounce of gold, $25, period. That's why you don't ever change prices. However, in order to keep the gold here in the country, you have to tie it to all other currencies around the world. So if you like a gold standard, you like a one world currency. That's what the gold standard is. Worst of all, if you take a look at who produces gold, we don't. So if you go to a gold standard, you have to take a look at A, where is the gold, and B, who produces it, and that's essentially turning our Federal Reserve over to Australia, Canada, South Africa, and Russia. I don't want them controlling our monetary policy, and that's what would happen with the gold standard.
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Wagner, you referred to the Federal Reserve as the lender of last resort. Yet the Federal Reserve in this decade, namely Ben Bernanke, was accused of causing this financial crisis. There's a book called The Bubble Man, expanding, keeping the interest rates low, causing the housing bubble, then the crash, and then the Federal Reserve is going to come along and bail us out from something it causes, expanding and contracting the money supply and credit. Meanwhile, we have bankruptcies, foreclosures, and wealth and power is sucked upwards. The big banks get bigger, and the smaller banks are driven out of business. Why is this a good policy for the Federal Reserve? And who are they actually working for?
Okay, that is a phenomenal question. That is, if you understand the question he just asked, that hits at the key of everything. All right? Through the CRA Act,
CRA is the Community Reinvestment Act.
Community Reinvestment Act.
I don't know what it is.
We forced banks to make very bad loans. You talk to a mortgage banker and they will tell you they made loans knowing there was going to be a high default rate on them. We then packaged them into bonds through Fannie and Freddie and through other organizations, and we sold them to banks that used them as a reserve currency, for their reserves. So through our fiscal policy and regulations, we basically put an economics AIDS virus in the banking system. Right? Then what happened? Then we started to monkey around with the energy prices back when, I can't remember what year it was, but the energy prices spiked up to $140 a barrel. That drove up inflation. That drove up the adjustable rate mortgages. That caused the collapse of the banking system because suddenly those bonds went to being worthless. The reserves of the banks went down. They could no longer make loans. Then the Fed stepped in. But my point here is the Fed did not cause the harm. They stepped in to rescue it once it happened. Now, if you want to make sure this never happens again, you repeal the CRA Act, you get rid of Fannie and Freddie, and you never let Congress distort the banking industry again. If you want to see a politicized bank, that's what Fannie and Freddie is. Okay, you saw what they did. When they got all that money, they were forcing loans to anybody who wanted them with a loan. You got no doc and low doc, but that has nothing to do with the Fed.
If I can add to the system here, the Fed did bail the banks out, and otherwise we probably would have fixed it by now. And one of the things that we're irritated about now is all the printing money and the $110 billion a month that comes with quantitative easing. Dr. Wagner was indicating if you want to know what's going on with inflation, you should look at the 10-year Treasury. It's 3%, and then look at the tips. That's true. The big elephant on the side of the room is that the 10-year Treasury should not be at 3% because we need $110 billion extra every month to spend. So we should have to go out and say, hey, Germany, we need $20 billion in Treasuries. Will you give it to us? And they say, you guys 3%? No way, get out of here. How about 4%? We'd say, China, can we have $10 billion? They'd say, no way, get out of here. 5%, you guys are a jump on. If we had to go out and get that money with real money that wasn't invented out of thin air, then interest rates on the 10-year would be more like 5, 6, 7. Jimmy Carter's bill is what we're talking about. And you can add a couple of percent to what they should be in a free market, and how would the housing market be doing then? That's how dire straits we're in. We don't like what they're doing, but we sure wouldn't like it if they didn't.
You know, a lot of the discussion here is based on a fallacy, and the fallacy is that someone has to manage the currency. Now, the currency should be a commodity. Now, what are commodities? This table's a commodity, right? Your computer is a commodity. Your basketballs are a commodity. You don't manage those, right? And if money is a commodity, it doesn't have to be managed. It self-manages. And that's what we got to get back to. We had it. When the Fed was created, we had a gold standard. Right? Franklin Roosevelt arbitrarily took us off that in 1933. We had that, then we had the silver standard. And that was, we were taken off that in 1968 by Lyndon Johnson, and then all of the gold window was closed by Richard Nixon in 1971. We now have not commodity money anymore, we have fiat money. The Latin word fiat means make do. Right? Fiat money is monopoly money. That's what we have today, and it continues to lose its value. And you know who knows it well? The Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians. Right? There are people now who want to shuck the dollar as the reserve currency for the world. Who can blame them? Who can blame them? And the fault has to lie again at the Federal Reserve. Now we talked about who gets to be the head of the Federal Reserve. What happens is somebody from the Federal Reserve goes to the President of the United States and says, here's who I want you to nominate next. And they dare not do it. Right? It was one of the Rothschilds who said, give me control of the nation's money, I care not who makes its laws. And isn't that going on? Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to get rid of the Fed. Right? Now we talked about the CPI, the Consumer Product Index. What a fraud that is. Right? The Consumer Product Index is supposed to measure what it costs for a basket of goods, right? And what they do is, all of a sudden, they change the basket, and they don't tell you that they've changed the basket. I went to the Department of Commerce years ago, and I asked them, I said, I'd like to know how you define the consumer product. The guy came out with papers this high, gave it all to me, he says, the answer's in there. I went through all of that, I didn't find out anything. Right? It's more secrecy involved. Consumer Price Index measures the rising in prices, and it's a fraud. But inflation is not rising prices. Inflation is an increase in the quantity of currency. That destroys the currency.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Mr. McManus. The money does not need to be managed. It's the other way around. It has intrinsic value. It manages the value of everything else. I really am kind of perplexed at the style of this debate. I want to make a few observations first. Mr. McManus represents the historical view, the prevailing view that our founding fathers held until about 1910, 1912. The guy in the middle, with all due respect, is kind of your political view. He's kind of really neutral, and he doesn't have a viewpoint. He didn't even know anything about the CFR, which, with all due respect, sir, for someone on a panel, you're really lacking in that area, because it is the CFR that is.
Well, that's your. By the way, let me defend him. That's your opinion. That's really well. I think if someone who disagrees with you thinks they're accurate too. So okay. That's not a matter of fact. That's a matter of opinion.
Okay, moving right along. Then the last guy, he's a corporate guy. He's a banker. He represents the banking viewpoint, the hedge fund guy. That's how he advertises himself on the radio when he calls up on Saturday morning and doesn't feed the end. Now, he's obviously going to cheerlead for the corporate banking system, which is what he does, and that's fine. He has that right. But the fact is, he makes many false statements, and I need to correct him before we move on. You like to pick on Ron Paul, Bob, by saying that the Ron Paul people have no answers. Well, they do have an answer. The first answer is auditing the Fed so that we can identify the problem. You first have to uncover the dirt.
Can you ask a question to
Well,
our
I'm
panel?
correcting his false
Well, I
statements.
understand, but I'm
It's
saying
very
that-
important these people know the truth.
Well, but, question,
Secondly, you often say that you cite all these depressions, Bob, and the reason that we had them was because of the inaction of the Fed. And it was because, actually, Bob, they withdrew credit. That's why the depressions occurred. Because credit was, the availability of credit was withdrew. Now, knowing that people like Thomas Jefferson, and this is my question, people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Henry Ford, James Madison, Charles Lindbergh, and a whole host of others are hostile, vehemently opposed to a central fiat banking system. How can you sit there, Bob, and tell the Tea Party patriot community that a Federal Reserve is a good thing when all of these great patriots in history and past differ with you?
Well, George Washington agreed with me. James Madison agreed with me. You know, bottom line is, this is the system we had. And like I've said 1,000 times, you give me a better alternative, and I'll take it. If we're going to go to a gold standard, you have to be able to argue whether an elastic currency is better than an inelastic currency. I think if you study what that means, you realize real quick you want an elastic currency that grows with the economy. You don't want the currency, you don't want a tail wagging the dog. You don't want the gold standard making the business cycles. You want the monetary policy to grow with the thing. The other thing is you have to argue, do you want to have flexible exchange rates or fixed exchange rates? More than likely, if you study the issue, you'll realize you want flexible exchange rates. That's what the Federal Reserve does. It creates an elastic currency, and we have flexible exchange rates. If you want to start putting restrictions on the free market, you do that with an inelastic currency. And if you want to see what happened, you know, many people study the Austrian business cycle. The Austrian business cycle was very vicious business cycles, right? Take a look at what period they studied. They studied the pre-Fed period, the 19th century business cycle. So when you hear these people talk about the Austrian business cycle, that's the gold standard, that's the inelastic currency, that's the vicious cycles that we went through. Now, we did have one Great Depression under the Federal Reserve, but that was through inaction. If you take a look at the 19th century, there are depressions all over the place.
we have about 3 minutes left, am I correct? I'm looking at my timer in the back. Well, whatever. Go, as long as it's a quick, very quick, please.
And HE jump in on free banking and what's wrong with free banking. And why can't we abolish legal tender laws and go to just free banking and allow people to, if you believe in freedom and free markets, why can't we have free markets in currency like everything else?
No, go ahead. Why don't you start?
I'm going to pass.
That's exactly what I advocate, free banking, right? Free banking, and stop and think. I said it before, I want to make the point again. We have a legal tender law that says only the Federal Reserve note is a legal tender. That's tyranny. Why can't gold be legal tender? Why can't silver be, right? And why can't we have free banking? Yes, that's what I'm in favor of. Something I wrote about in my book. I'm sorry this book is out of print. I wish I had a lot more of them. I think you might find it valuable. I think it's even better than The Creature from Jekyll Island, and Ed Griffin's a good friend of mine.
All right, here we go with the Kumbaya Fest. I'm all for free banking. As a matter of fact, we do a presentation on how to improve upon the system. The problem with the gold standard is that we don't control the gold. And there's no reason to have a convertible currency into a metal that we don't produce. Why not have it convertible into a basket of goods? And so what I propose is either a CPI basket convertible currency. So if you ever wanted to convert your currency, which people never do, you could convert it into a basket of goods made here in the U.S. So it would be made in America dollar, or just simply have what I call as a collateral dollar, where you take, you used to take a gold to the mint and then mint gold into it. Why not just take your home mortgage, the equity, take it and say, okay, print me up some money, that's my collateral. Okay? That's the way to get around the Federal Reserve. That's the way to have a convertible currency, but the convertibility goes to something made here in America, not in South Africa.
Well, I'm being cut off.
It's basically a yes or no type thing.
Go ahead, yes or no.
Didn't the United States, when the dollar came to its height of preeminence, wasn't it a backed currency, whether it was by gold or by silver? Wasn't it a backed currency and not a pure fiat currency?
Yes, it was, and it's maintained it since then. But remember, the Bretton Woods tied all global currencies together, and that's what the gold standard is a global currency.
I'm being waved out. I want to thank my speakers for coming. And we'll be around for a few minutes if you have any questions.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to do it again as again.
Well, we get to do it tomorrow.
Is there any such thing as real money? I say that we borrow money from Japan. Japan's broke. Where did they get it? And they buy it. So there is no real money. It's just a big Ponzi scheme that the world's in a circle.